Hello everyone, this is Nick Perry at Schaeffer's Investment Research with your chart slideshow for Friday, May 11th. Today I am back with my weekly check of the broad market indices. In last week's chart slideshow, we talked about the overall constructive trends, the fact that the broad market indices were clearly in an uptrend, and we talked about support sort of coming off those prior peaks on the SPX, the Dow, and the Comp. And we also noted that the rut was sort of trading at resistance, sort of in consolidation, was having a little bit of trouble breaking out. When we turn to this week's charts, we see a little bit of a pullback. Obviously, yesterday was the biggest component of that, but sort of looking at this a little bit bigger, you see a little bit of a rounding pattern here. With just a couple of days, a few days worth of activity, it's hard to make too much out of that, but it is worth noting because basically, we've been in this uptrend. We're seeing a little bit of a pullback. Today's action will obviously go, pretty far in determining how this plays out. It's a little afternoon at this point. The SPX is up about 10 points, which means it's recouping about half of yesterday's drop. So basically, what I'm looking at here is how this rounding plays out. If we do see a little bit of a breakdown here, in yesterday's blog I mentioned short-term support right there. We kind of dipped below that, but today we're back above it. Let me clear off the chart here. Alright, so basically what I'm looking at on this chart is the uptrend right now is technically still intact. But we are seeing that little bit of a rounding. You've got a little bit of short-term support right there that we're flirting with. You've also got a very short-term support level right there. Both of those are very minor support levels. Just something to watch. This area here is the bigger term support level. Basically, that was resistance there. And you can also see the 50-day moving average, the green line here, is moving up. So if we did see a pullback, next week, the 50-day moving average would move up, and kind of give you another gauge right there to see how strong it is, how it holds there. As far as the Dow and the Comp, those charts are pretty much, let's call them derivatives of the SPX chart that we just talked about. We've got the uptrend. Instead of having so much of a rounding, it's just more of a consolidation, but you still have that bigger term support level here coming off this peak, and you've got the rising 50-day moving average. When you look at the Comp, the rounding is definitely more pronounced here, but again, you've still got support from this resistance area, and you've got the 50-day moving average moving up, though there's a little bit more of a gap here. But all in all, these charts aren't too different than what we just discussed on the SPX. And lastly, we have the rut. The rut continues to show a somewhat different pattern than the other three charts, but there's nothing different than what we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. Basically, we did have an uptrend, and that appears to have flattened out into a consolidation. The consolidation just happens to be occurring at this area right here, which was the prior resistance. It's forming this big trading range potentially. If that's the case, this support down here would be something to keep in mind, but that's down the road. I'm not looking for that to happen next week. If that does happen next week, there's probably going to be a lot of excitement, so I'm not really looking for that. But basically, it's we've had this uptrend, and now we're in a consolidation phase, and that's not necessarily bearish to me. It's just it's holding its own. It's just sort of in a holding pattern here. As far as my overall takeaways for the week, basically, for the most part, the uptrends remained intact. We're seeing a little bit of, pullback here yesterday. Some of the charts kind of showing a little bit of a rounding pattern. Not enough to break the uptrend yet, but that's definitely something to keep an eye on early next week and throughout next week. But basically, if we do see a pullback, we've got some support levels that we'll keep an eye on. Those are a little bit away, so if we do see that, that would be a pretty dramatic plunge next week for this to happen. So I'm not necessarily calling for that to happen, but just if we do start to see a pullback, those are the levels ultimately I'm going to be keeping an eye on. But basically, the uptrends remain intact, yada yada yada, same thing I've been saying over and over, but it is what it is. So anyway, have a great weekend, and as always, stay tuned to the blog for further updates.